All right, hello everyone, and I'm back with another video. This is in the midst of exam season, so many of you have been requesting this video for a while. We've just had our P1, I think it was yesterday, and P2 is in a couple of days. I have uploaded a video on how to attempt a P2 paper, but I said in that I would separately discuss how to design a study and make an entire video on that. And I finally had a little bit of time to get to that right now. So let's not waste any further time and get right into it. Now, I'm using a sample question over here, which I believe is from the October-November 2023 paper. I think this is paper 2, variant 3, if I'm not mistaken. And a few things I want to point out in this question. Let's read what the question says. Dr. Birkin is planning an observational study of children's imaginary play behavior. For example, a child might use a leaf as a plate or a big cardboard box as a boat or a house. Describe how Dr. Birkin could conduct an observational study of children to investigate their imaginary play behavior. Now, if you, and by the way, a lot of students are asking how we can prepare for paper two, because, with all the new studies, that there aren't really any past papers for the new studies. But for paper two, luckily, you can use past papers. You can even use them for paper one, but you can definitely use past papers from 2018 all the way to 2023 because it's based on your knowledge of research methods. And only a few questions ever come that are related to the studies in paper two. In some years, there are questions that have never been linked to any of the 12 studies. It's just purely research methods. I think there was one in 2021 that was like this. So, yes, your knowledge of the studies is important with respect to aspects such as the aim of the study, the IVDV of the study, how it's operationalized, the research methodology, the sampling technique, experimental design, the way the data is collected, um, you know, reliability, validity, generalizability, ethics, all of these points relating to studies, conclusions of the studies. So this is stuff that you should know about the studies. You're not really required to know the background, the psychology being investigated. Um, you should know the procedure, but at least aspects that are linked to research methods. For example, if counterbalancing is being used, you should know how data is collected, if any formula is being used. For example, in Andrade, you have a way of calculating the doodling, the monitoring score or the recall score. Similarly, in Hassett, you have a way of calculating the magnitude of preference. In Fagan, you have a way of calculating or recording session time. So the way the data is being recorded is very important. Um, and yeah, so that's mainly the stuff. And you don't really need to go over the application issues and debates either. That's not part of paper two. But what is part of paper two is at the end of paper two, you have one 10-mark question where you have to design your own study. And some information will be given to you, and some information will obviously not be given to you. So you will have to figure out what you can and what you cannot use from the question that has been given to you while designing your answer, designing or planning your study. So any past paper from 2018 to 2023, you can practice the studies, you can practice the questions, sorry. You can practice the 10-mark questions as well, where you have to design your study. However, one thing they've introduced this year, if you look at the specimen paper and if you look at the Feb paper 2024, you will notice that they've started adding an extra line in the question, which states, do not refer to sampling technique or ethical guidelines in your answer. So if you guys are attempting any question or design question from 2018 to 2023, I would recommend you add this line to the question and try not to refer to the sampling technique or ethical guidelines in your answer. However, if let's say this particular year they or for your particular exam they decide not to ask this decide not to include this restriction, this limitation in your answer, then you would obviously be required to refer to the sampling technique and the ethical guidelines. But if they specifically ask you not to do this, then you obviously would not need to include it in your answer. And one reason why maybe they're asking you not to include this is because perhaps a lot of students would use this as a point in part B. So in previous exams in part B, they would ask you to write a weakness of your answer. And a lot of people would refer to generalizability, sample, ethical issues, which was a bit too easy. So they decided to make it a little tough. And they would say, do not refer to sample ethics or sampling technique while discussing your weakness. Now they've gone one step further from that, and they've included in part A, where they say, do not refer to sampling technique or ethical guidelines while simply planning your answer, while planning your design study. And part B, by the way, has also changed. So another thing you would want to change when practicing past papers from 2018 to 2023 is in part B, they ask you for a weakness. Now what they've started doing is they ask you for a strength. And it's split into two parts, B part 1 for 2 marks and B part 2. In B part 1, they ask you what a strength is of your study. And in B part 2, they ask you to explain why it's a strength. And what are the points that you should include for a strength? We'll discuss that when we get to part B. But let's talk about part A first. So over here, the question is, Dr. Birkin is planning an observational study. Okay, the key term here is he's planning an observational study of what? Of children's imaginary play behavior, for example, and they've given you an idea of, what they're trying to say. A child might use a leaf as a plate or a big cardboard box as a boat or a house. Okay, so they're just giving you a few examples. You can use these, but you can obviously come up with your own examples as well of imaginary play behavior of children. Describe how Dr. Birkin could conduct an observational study of children to investigate their imaginary play behavior. So there are always going to be two pieces of information that will be given to you in the study. One is obviously the aim, okay, which is quite obvious that they're testing the imaginary play behavior of children. And the second is the type of study they want you to conduct. So over here, they specifically mentioned that they want you to conduct an observational study. However, they haven't specified exactly what type of observation. Now, considering the exam, P2 exam is just a few days away, you guys should know what are the different types of observations, okay? You have a structured observation, you have an unstructured observation, you have covert, overt, you have naturalistic, controlled, and participant, non-participant. So if you look at the past papers, you will come across some questions where they've asked you to design an observational study where they've been really specific and they've said design a covert observation or design an overt observation or a structured observation or a controlled observation or a non-participant observation. Now, when they are being as specific as that, then you have to stick to the specific observational technique that they've asked you to use. For instance, if they ask you to use a structured observation and you don't end up putting a checklist in your answer, you will lose out on a lot of marks. If they ask you to design a covert observation and you haven't explained details of how the observers will be covert, will be hidden, you will lose out on marks. Over here, they haven't specified exactly what type of observation they want you to conduct. So you have a bit of freedom there. You can choose the type of observation you wish to conduct, be it a structured observation, be it a covert, overt, participant, non-participant. And obviously all of these can overlap, right? So you have the freedom to include multiple types of observations, but don't go overboard with it. Don't end up writing about all 8, okay? So just keep it realistic, because the one thing that the examiner is looking for a good 10-mark design study is a study that is replicable, which means it's realistic to the extent that you can actually repeat it in everyday life. Okay, something that can be repeated by other researchers. So make sure it's realistic. Okay, use your imagination, be creative, but keep it realistic. Don't go overboard. Make sure you're trying to impress the examiner, but not over impress the examiner. And when I say that, I mean some students end up putting an interview and then an observation and all of that in one answer when it's just not needed. And they'll end up putting a couple of stooges, confederates again when it's not needed. So keep it simple and show good knowledge of research method terms. Okay, so make sure you're showing your knowledge of the different research method techniques that you're being asked to use. For example, over here in observation. So if you opt for a structured observation, then allow the researcher to see that you are well versed in what a structured observation is. And it uses a behavioral checklist, and then you can elaborate on the checklist. You can give examples of the behaviors on the checklist and so on. Now, when designing any study, there are a few points that you keep in mind. Who, what, where, when, and how. Okay. So let's take a look at each of these points. And this can be just a little bit of brainstorming that you can do on the side with a pencil on the paper, just so that you have your points which you can refer to when designing a study, just to ensure that you're not missing out on any of these key points. Okay. When we talk about the who, we are essentially talking about the participants of the study. Okay. And when we refer to the participants, we want to talk about their features, and we want to talk about how many there are as well. So maybe like the quantity of participants. So if they haven't mentioned how many participants there are, then it's up to you how many you want to include. If they haven't mentioned any specific features, then you can add whatever features of the participants you want to, as long as it's appropriate to the situation. Now, what we do know from our study is that it's being done on children and their play behavior, right? So we would want to keep young children, but they haven't mentioned exactly how many. So you are free to choose the amount of participants you want. You can have a mix of both boys and girls. You can specify the age range as well. Children may be aged 5 to 7 if you want. So you're free to choose the features of the participants of the children in the study. One thing you have to keep is one thing you cannot change is the fact that participants are children. So that's not something you can change. But other than that, you're free to add how many and how many males, females, and their age and so on. Okay. However, although this is a very important point, perhaps it's no longer required in your design answers from 2024 onwards because of this. Do not refer to sample or sampling technique. If your question includes this line, immediately all of this will be scrapped. There is no need to refer to this. So an entire part of the planning, the who aspect, will be no longer required in your answer. All right. You can refer to the participants as children, but you're not going to elaborate on the details or the features of the participants. So there is no longer a need to say how many participants there are, their features, how many male, how many female, their age. None of that is a requirement now. All right. It'll only be a requirement if this particular part is not mentioned in the exam. But because they've started mentioning it, I'm guessing, it's not something that is expected or required anymore. However, the who is not just restricted to the participants. It's also talking about observers, experimenters, observers, or even stooges or confederates. Now, like I said earlier, there is no need to force a stooge or confederate in your answer. All right. If it were a study where you're observing helping behavior, then yeah, maybe you might want to put in a stooge to create a scenario where participants would be urged to go and help. So if it makes sense to put a stooge, if it's absolutely essential, then yeah, talk about the stooge, talk about the role of the stooge, the features of the stooge. Is it male? Is it female? Because that would be, important with respect to controlling potential confounding variables. Like, for example, in Piliavan, the victim was male, the victim was young, dressed casually. All this information was not set for no reason. It was set for a particular purpose, which was to control possible confounding variables. Similarly, over here, if you need to put a stooge, mention what the role of the stooge would be and talk about any important features that are relevant to the study of the stooge. But if you don't need a stooge, don't put one. Put observers if you're doing an observation. If it's a self-report study where you're conducting an interview or a questionnaire, then obviously there is no need to put an observer. But if it's an experiment, or if it's a longitudinal study, or if it's a correlational study, and you wish to observe the participants, then yes, you would put observers. And if it says to conduct an observational study like over here, then you would definitely need to use an observer. All right. So talk about the observers, talk about the type of observation that they're doing. Are they participant, non-participant? Are they covert? Are they overt? Elaborate on how you would make them covert, overt, or participant, non-participant. Don't just say that they're non-participant. If you're saying they're non-participant, you could say that maybe they're observing from a distance behind a one-way mirror. Elaborate on these points. Show the examiner that you know exactly why you're saying it's an overt, covert, participant, non-participant observation, rather than just stating it in your answer. All right, so that is the who. What else do we have? We have so who at the moment is not really a big requirement. The what, however, is a major requirement. The what includes aspects such as the research method technique, which is going to be given to you. All right. They've told you they want you to do an observational study. So that is something you cannot change. So you have to do an observation. So that is the research method technique chosen for your study. Now, if they had given you an experiment or a correlational study or a longitudinal study, then within those research method techniques, you can choose to use observations and self-reports. Observations or self-report. You don't have to use both. Right? For example, Piliavin is an experiment, field experiment, but it also uses an observation, right? Which one was that? Holzil is an experiment, but it also uses a self-report, right? So you can use these secondary research method techniques, these data collection methods, if you wish to collect data in your answer, in your study, right? So over here, because it's not saying that you're conducting an experiment or a case study or a correlation or a self-report, it's simply saying observation. So we will stick to just an observation, right? If it says observation, you cannot change it to an experiment. But if it says experiment, you can use an observation within the experiment. If it says self-report, you can't change it to an observation. But if it says observation, then again, you cannot change it to a self-report. However, if it's a case study or correlation or experiment, as I said earlier, you can choose self-report or observation or both if you wish to collect data in your answer. So it's an observation over here. Along with this, you can talk about the IV and the DV, the independent variable and the dependent variable. However, you would only include an IV and a DV if you were asked to design an experiment, which is not the case over here. So if the question says describe how Dr. Birkin can conduct an experiment, then you would have to have an IV and you would have to have a DV. Okay, go back to my research method notes, my research method videos, see what I've said about an experiment. I talk about how an experiment is one where there is an IV and a DV. So an IV and a DV is only a feature of an experiment. If they ask you to design a case study, a self-report study, an observational study, a correlational study, you cannot put an IV-DV. All right, an IV-DV will only be there if they ask you to conducting an experiment. You can still have an observation and self-report, but the IV-DV aspect is not part of the self-report or the observation, it's part of the experiment. Okay, so for this particular question, we don't need an IV, we don't need a DV. And we don't need an experimental design either, repeated independent measures, because obviously an experimental design works with the IV. So there is no experimental design in this particular question, at least. The type of data, what type of data are you collecting? Is it quantitative? Is it qualitative? All right, that's important. Keep in mind, you're not actually going to give results. You can't say that the participants scored this or these were the number of participants who did this, because if you're giving results, then you're assuming that you've already done the study, which is obviously not the case. You're just explaining how you're planning on doing the study if you were to do it. So if you haven't done the study, you cannot have results. So don't end up making results up of your own. But you can talk about the type of data that you're collecting, quantitative, qualitative, or both. You can talk about ethical guidelines, right? If they're relevant to the study, if you're debriefing them, if you're deceiving them, if the consent is being taken, all of that. However, again, if they mention in the question, do not refer to ethical guidelines, then it is not relevant to the situation or the question. The sampling method is also important, but again, if they are telling you not to refer to sampling technique, then you would not talk about it. And any controls that you may want to keep in mind, right? So all of that comes under the what. Now, the where is a small part. If you do not remember to write about the where, it refers to it as a minor omission. The major omission is the what and the how, and at times the who. Minor omissions are where and when, which means you might lose out on a few marks, 1 or 2 marks, if you forget to write about the where or when. The where is simply the location of the study, all right? Sometimes it's very obvious in the question, sometimes it's not mentioned and you have to figure it out. Sometimes you can choose any location, all right? I see a lot of times where they don't ask you to conduct an experiment and you end up saying it's being done in the lab and the IV is this and the DV is this, and you end up turning it into an experiment. Please don't do that. If they say it's a naturalistic observation or if it's a field experiment, then obviously the location has to be something natural. I've seen a lot of times where they've asked you to conduct a field experiment and you end up doing it in the lab, right? So that doesn't make any sense. Over here, the location would perhaps be a nursery because we're dealing with children, young children, and their play behavior. So a playground, a nursery, play area. So such locations would be relevant to this study. The when is kind of like the time frame of the study, all right? Is it a 1 day study? Is it a 2 day study? If it's a longitudinal study, then talk about how long it is. Is it for a couple of months, weeks, years, etc.? If it's a case study, how long is it? How many trials are you keeping? What is the duration of a trial, for example? How long are you observing the participants for? How many days is the observation going on for? So all of that comes under the when. The how is very closely linked to the what. You can almost consider it the operationalization of the what. If you have an IVDV, how are you operationalizing it? If you have an experimental design of independent repeated, how are you allocating participants to the different levels of the IV? How are you implementing controls in your study? How are you acquiring the participants? If you can talk about the sample, that is. How are you implementing ethical guidelines? Again, if you are allowed to talk about ethics, which in this particular case you're not. How are you collecting the data? Okay. So all of that comes under the how aspect. And this is where you have to be creative, because this is essentially the part of the study, the part of the planning where you are creating your procedure. Okay. Now, they don't ever give you an entire procedure and they say that you have to do this. You have to come up with your own procedure. So every student's answer can be different. You can have similar answers, but everyone will come up with their own procedure because it's based on your creativity, right? So you have to come up with a way of how you're going to observe children's play behavior, imaginary play behavior, right? The answer I've written, which I'll show you in a bit, could be very different from the answer you might want to write, right? So there is no one perfect answer, but as long as you check all these boxes, this one I'll put a question mark because it depends on this. But if you check all these boxes correctly, accurately, it's a well thought out study, it's a replicable study, good use of research method terms. There is no reason why you can't get an A in this. All right. Any other point I want to make before I show you my sample answer? So yeah, one thing you would want to do is go over the research method techniques and look at their features. Because let's take a look at all the different types of studies they can ask you to design. They can ask you to design an experiment. Sometimes they'll just say design an experiment. But in AS, usually they're a lot more specific and they might say design either a lab experiment. This is what came in, I think, variant 2.2, October, November 2023. They can ask you to design a field experiment. They can ask you to design a natural experiment. So you should know the features of each, okay? They can ask you to design an observational study. And again, within observations, you should know the types, okay? You should know what is a structured observation. If they ask me to design a structured observation, what do I need to put? What do I not need to put? If they ask me about designing a covert observation, what do I need to do? What do I not need to do? Right? So the different types of observations go over. So you can take a look at my research method notes for that. I do have a document on my Google Drive on how to design your study that actually explains what comes under the what for every single research method technique. So if they ask you to design, let's say, a structured observation, what would you put in the structured observation part? All right. If they ask you to design, let's say, a correlational study, a longitudinal study, what would you need to add? What would you not need to add? So do take a look at that. all right? And I've also given an example of a self-report answer at the bottom of that document as well. So for those of you who want to check that out, you can just contact me and I'll give you the link. It's on the Google Drive though. So yeah, observation self-report. They can ask you to design a self-report study. And within a self-report, they can be specific and say design a questionnaire-based study. So in a questionnaire study, you would have to give examples of open questions, closed questions. They can ask you to design an interview study. And just like they've said, design an observational study, they can be very general and say design an interview-based study, or they can be specific and say design a structured interview. Now, if you don't know what a structured interview is, then you would lose out on marks. If they ask you to design a structured interview, you would have to ensure that all participants are being asked the same questions in the same order, and you're not asking any additional questions, right? So you would have to know these features. You wouldn't ask them any questions through questionnaire, then you wouldn't observe them because that's not a requirement of an interview. You wouldn't put in IVDV either. So, these are all features that you should know. And they could ask you to design a semi-structured interview, an unstructured interview. So that document I'm referring to will explain exactly what all you need to and do not need to add in your answer for each specific research method technique. They could ask you to design a case study. Okay, for that you would have to have one participant. You would talk about how you're doing the study over a long time period. And within the case study, you can do an observation or self-report. You can design a correlational study. They might ask you to design this. You won't have an IVDV in this either, but you still will have two variables and you're looking for a relationship between the two variables. And you can talk about how you're operationalizing the two variables, again, through self-report or observation. And they can ask you to design a longitudinal study, right? A longitudinal study is basically done over a long time period. You can use an observation, you can do self-report, it can even be a longitudinal experiment, by the way. Like Holzil was a longitudinal experiment. Case studies are longitudinal, right? So within the longitudinal study, what do you need to put? What do you not need to put? Again, take a look at my notes. They can ask you to conduct a cross-sectional study as well. The difference between a cross-sectional study and a longitudinal study is a longitudinal study will be done on the same participants over a long time period, whereas in a cross-sectional study, you're comparing different groups of participants. Somewhat similar to, you can say, an independent measure design, but that's a specific feature of an experiment. This is different. This is a way of doing a study by comparing different groups, like maybe people age 20 to 30 compared to people age 40 to 50 compared to people age 60 to 70 and so on. All right. So yeah, research methods revision, very important for this and generally for the whole of paper too. Moving on, let's take a look at the sample answer that I've written. Dr. Birkin is planning an observational study of children's imaginary play behavior. For example, a child might use a leaf as a plate or a big cardboard box as a boat or a house. Describe how Dr. Birkin could conduct an observational study of children to investigate their imaginary play behavior. Try to underline key terms in the question so you know what you have to write about. Take some time out to do a little bit of planning, see what you want to write, think your answer out, and then try to write it in a nice flow. Now, I have seen some candidate responses where they don't write it as a way I've written it. They format it differently. The answers where they put the heading who, and then they've talked about the who. These are the participants, this is how we recruited them, and so on. They've put the what, they've mentioned the research method technique is this is how I'm doing it, this is the IV, this is how I've operationalized the IV, and so on. And they put the heading of the where, the when, and the how. So that is one way of doing it. I don't recommend that way. I recommend you write it in a well-structured answer with a nice flow, the way I have. Personally, this is my preference, and I'm not entirely sure how well accepted the other style is with the headings. So let's just be on the safe side and use this format. All right. So the way I usually start is I like to talk about the sample, but because I can't do that anymore, I'll just mention briefly what the researcher is doing over here. Dr. Birkin can conduct his, let me use my pointer. Dr. Birkin can conduct his study on a group of children at a playground. So I've mentioned where the study is being done at a local nursery, right? So the when is out of the way right in the beginning. His aim is to observe their imaginary play behavior. So I've let the examiner know that I know very clearly what the aim of the study is. Now let's get right into the procedure. Let's talk about the type of observation that I'm conducting. He can conduct his study by using a behavioral checklist, hence making his study a structured observation. So I've let the examiner know what type of observation I'm doing specifically, and that I know what a structured observation is because I've said they're using a behavioral checklist. He would place some objects in the nurseries from getting into the setup of the procedure. He would place some objects in the nursery beforehand so the children could use these objects to play with. All right, so I've already set up my environment in a way. So maybe you can consider it like a controlled observation. Maybe it's a natural environment observation as well because it's being done in the natural playground. The only little bit of controls I'm putting is I'm placing some objects beforehand. What are the objects I'm placing beforehand? Objects that he would place in the nursery would include a leaf, a cardboard box. So I'm taking these examples that they've given in the question, and I've given a few more of my own. A stick, a hollow tube, and a basket. So remember when I said you have to be creative? This is where I'm showing my creativity. And you know how I said that everyone can come up with their own answer? Some of you might come up with other objects, right? The reason now I'm explaining why I'm using these objects and I'm not putting conventional toys. Now, most of you might be putting conventional toys such as a ball, a dollhouse, action figures, racing cars, etc. There's a reason why I'm not putting those type of toys, and I'm explaining that reason. So this is a point that I'm actually, impressing the examiner with because I'm going into a lot of detail in my procedure, and it shows why it's a very valid study. The reason for not including conventional toys such as action figures, dolls, or balls is that children may prefer these toys over the other objects in the room, which would not allow Dr. Birkin to investigate how imaginative the children could potentially be while playing. So, when we talk about imaginary play behavior, what does that mean? So, understand what the question is asking you. They're asking you to observe children playing while using their imagination. So, you know how young children, obviously, you give them toys, you give them a ball, they'll throw it. If you give them a racing car, they'll just drive it around, they'll race it around. If you give them any other toy, there's a very specific way of playing with specific toys, right? But if you give them random objects, at times you see a child holding a stick and you'll see he'll turn it into a sword or a bat. That's them using their creativity. That's them using their imagination. Using random objects that aren't even toys, if they start playing with them, the only way you can play with objects that aren't toys is by using your imagination. So by eliminating toys as the objects and placing other random objects, I'm allowing the children to actually use their imagination in their play behavior. All right. If I had used traditional conventional toys, maybe they would not be using their imagination that much. So I want to really take a look at how imaginative they can be while playing, which is why I'm not putting toys, I'm putting other objects. And let's see how imaginative they can possibly get. Now, let's talk about the behavioral checklist. The behavioral checklist will include the following categories of play behavior. Now, if you're going to talk about the behavioral checklist, give examples of the categories. HACCP did not just say that we have a checklist and then ask you to guess the behaviors, right? They had a whole bunch of behaviors that they're looking for to see if the monkeys display any of these, and they've described the behaviors. Fagan has a checklist as well of 5 behaviors that are part of the trunk wash, and they've described the behaviors as well. Same with Bandura. They haven't just said physical aggression, verbal aggression, they've given examples of that as well. So I can't just say that I have a checklist and not give examples. I have to give examples of them and I have to describe those examples as well. So what are the behaviors on my checklist? What are the categories? Plays with leaf, plays with cardboard, plays with stick, plays with tube, plays with basket. But I need to operationalize these behaviors. I need to give examples of what I mean when I say plays with leaf. If you're taking a leaf and throwing it up and down, that's not really an imaginative behavior. So I need to observe the child playing with these objects in an imaginative style. So I've described what I mean by that. So examples of how each of the categories would be operationalized include imagining the leaf as a plate or hat, imagining the cardboard box as a house, using the stick as a sword or bat, imagining the hollow tube as a telescope or binoculars, And lastly, imagining the basket has food and pretending that they are at a picnic. All right. Again, this is where my creativity comes in. You guys can come up with whatever answer you want. And by the way, a lot of times you will come across a question for 10 marks that might be very similar to one of the studies in your syllabus, one of the 12 studies. At times, it may be a mix of two studies from your syllabus. So a lot of students ask, can we just take points from the actual study? And the answer is yes. Do not copy paste the entire study, but you can take ideas from the original studies. Okay. So, for example, in one, I remember they asked a question in which they wanted you to design a field experiment to test obedience of students to teachers, depending on whether the teachers are formally dressed or informally dressed. Now, the moment you see obedience, you're like, oh, Milgram. And then you'll end up putting a shock generator, and then you'll see if the children are giving shocks to their teachers and so on, which obviously would not make any sense, right? Make sure it's something realistic. Just because it says obedience does not necessarily mean Milgram. But you can use ideas from Milgram. For example, if it's talking about, you know, showing obedience, then you can make sure that both the teachers, the formal, informally dressed teacher, are speaking in a stern manner. You can come up with ways of operationalizing the obedience, obviously not through a shock generator, but other ways. So you need to see what you can and what you cannot take from the original articles and put in your answer. There was one question where they asked you to design a lab experiment to see whether external stimuli such as sounds or smell become part of your dream. You can take ideas from Dement Gleitman, right? You can make the participants come to the lab with the regular sleeping hours, not have any coffee, alcohol. You can use the EEG machine to determine if they're sleeping or not. You can wake them up and record their responses through a tape recorder, just like Dement Gleitman. So it depends. You can use a lot of examples and points from the studies, but there's no need to take the exact procedure and replicate it because they won't give you that exact study to do. It'll be similar, but not the same. This one, however, is not linked to any of the 12 studies. So sometimes they can give you a completely random scenario and you would have to just maybe not take any ideas from other studies and just come up with your own. So where were we? Yeah, I've given examples of the play behavior and their descriptions. Dr. Birkin would appoint two observers for inter-observer reliability who would be non-participant observers covertly observing the children at a distance to record the play behavior of the children. So I've mentioned that they're non-participant. How are they non-participant? They're observing the children at a distance and the children do not know that they're being observed to avoid demand characteristics. Therefore, it is a covert observation. All right, that demand characteristic points I've mentioned at the end. They would do this through time sampling. Now, time sampling, for those of you who don't know, take a look at my 2.5-hour research method video on my channel. Skip to the part about time sampling or just simply look at my PDF notes and see what I've written about time sampling. Time sampling is something that was used in Hassett as well as Bandura. It is a way of recording behaviors in an observation, right? You set a certain time limit, and within that time limit, you record the number of observations according to your checklist. So, for example, in Bandura, in phase 3, each child was observed for 20 minutes, and after every 5-second intervals, they recorded the behavior of the child to see if they displayed any of the behaviors in the checklist. So that is a form of time sampling. That's specifically an instantaneous scan. All right. So not many people know this, but there are 3 forms of time sampling: instantaneous scan, 1-0 scan, and predominant activity scan. So for those of you who are interested in knowing about those, take a look at my notes. In your design study, you don't have to be very specific and say instantaneous scan was used or predominant activity scan was used. Just simply say time sampling. All right. So I've said time sampling was used, but I've explained how. Where the children would be observed with the objects for 20 minutes, that's the time I've set, with observations being recorded at 10-second intervals. Similar to what Bandura did. Bandura did it at 5-second intervals. The duration each child spends playing with each object would be recorded to provide quantitative data. So I've explained the type of data I'm collecting and how I'm collecting it. All right. And one thing I've also said is every single child's duration will be for 20 minutes. So it's not like one child is playing longer than others. And that is a control I'm putting in my study, because if a child is playing longer or shorter than others, then, it depends on, then that would be a confounding variable, because maybe if you're playing longer, you would be maybe more imaginative, maybe less imaginative, maybe you might get tired. So it's good to keep the duration the same. So that's a control. The duration each child spends playing with each object, so how much time they're spending on each object, would be recorded to provide quantitative data. So that's the numerical data. Whereas the imaginative play behavior with the toys would provide qualitative data. Now, if you want, you can even go into more detail and come up with a formula of how you want to measure the quantitative data if there is a need to do that. I decided there wasn't. So I just said that I'll be recording the amount of time that they spent. I can say in minutes or seconds. I should have said that. I didn't include that over here, which would provide quantitative data, whereas the imaginative play behavior with the toys would provide qualitative data. Now, a good way to end your answer is to describe how you're going to represent the data. The quantitative data could be represented in the form of a bar chart for analysis. And finally, the purpose of observers being non-participant cohort is to ensure that the children do not display any demand characteristics. So do you see the detail that goes into designing a 10-mark answer, right? Someone else could have just said that the researcher will be conducting an observational study. It will be cohort, it will be non-participant. They'll be using a checklist. They'll have 5 behaviors. They will see if the child plays with the leaf or if they play with a cardboard box or other objects. The 2 observers for integrated reliability. They'll be observed for 20 minutes, where the observers will observe their imaginary play behavior. The data will be quantitative and qualitative, and then it will be analyzed. Right? That's usually how I've seen a lot of students answer questions. Very vague. The points are all there, no elaboration whatsoever. So instead of a 10, you might get like a 4 or a 5. So look at the detail I've put in my answer. This is what you would be needing to do in order to design a 10-mark answer. Now, this is still a slightly difficult question, so I intentionally use this one. I find experiments the easiest ones, because in experiments, you can actually elaborate quite a bit. You can talk about the IVDV, its operationalizations. I'm not sure if in the other documents I've given an example of a sample experiment, but I will be, for those of you who are part of the group, today is the 27th of April, 2024. And I think on the 29th or 28th, I'll be keeping an online class for free where I'll be discussing a little bit more about how to design your study. So I'll maybe discuss the experiment in that. I'll try to record that meeting so I can upload it over here on this channel as well. Let's take a look at part B. Why have I written part C over here? It should be part B. Oh, I made a mistake. This should have actually been 10 part A. And this should have been 10 part B1 and part B2. I don't know why I put C. Anyways, let's see what it says. Describe one practical methodological strength of the procedure you describe in your answer to part A. Do not refer to sample, sampling method, or ethics in your answer. This used to be a weakness. This to ask you what is one weakness and how can you overcome it. And it used to be one 4-mark question. Now they started asking about a practical or methodological strength. Methodological strength or practical strength. Practical means anything that would maybe cause you a bit of convenience, all right? Methodological means anything related to ethics, generalizability, validity, or reliability. However, because you can't talk about ethics or sample, your strength, if you want to talk about methodological strength, should be either about validity or about reliability, all right? For example, 2 observers to integrated reliability. And then you can, in part B2, they will ask you, why is it a strength? Let's take a look at what part B2 is saying. Explain why the feature you mentioned in your procedure part 1 is a strength. So part 1, you have to mention what the strength is. And in part 2, you have to explain why it's a strength. So let's see the answer I've written. One strength of the study is the operationalization of the behavioral categories in the checklist, with each of the 5 play behaviors being defined with examples of their respective imaginary behaviors. So I didn't just mention the 5 behaviors, I operationalized and I defined all the 5 behaviors on my checklist. That is my strength. Why is that a strength? The reason why this is a strength is because play behavior of children can be subjective, right? And therefore difficult to observe and identify. So by defining each behavior with examples, it allows the researchers to be able to clearly and accurately record the imaginary play behavior of the children, which would increase the validity. So I'm able to identify exactly what I mean by plays with leaf, plays with cardboard box, plays with tube, etc. So I'm not leaving it to my own subjectivity. I'm giving a specific definition for the behavior, so I know specifically what I'm looking for. all right, which would increase the validity. This is obviously one strength. You can come up with many other points that you want: inter-rater reliability, inter-observer reliability if you want to go for reliability, ways that you made the procedure standardized. All right, I decided to go for validity. All right, so I hope this was helpful to you guys. Please, again, um, take a look at my research method notes, take a look at my designer study notes for those of you who want access to it. A lot of you guys email me. I would prefer it if you guys could WhatsApp me instead. All right, my number is mentioned below in the description, as well as the link to the WhatsApp group if you want to join. So yeah, just one more paper to go. I know most of you found paper one easy, and you're wondering if paper two will be very difficult. I think last year, May, June, paper one was relatively easy, and everyone thought paper two would be really tough. But paper two is actually quite simple as well. So yeah, take a look at my paper two video to see what to expect, and hope this was helpful to you guys. So I will now try to work on content for A2. Been neglecting that a bit, but hopefully a lot of videos coming up for A2 as well very soon. Right. Thank you guys. Take care. Bye bye. And best of luck for your exams.